The dish was still moving when the rest of the world stopped. That was the thing I couldn't get past, those first few hours. The big radio telescope on the ridge above our observatory ran on its own schedule, slewing across the sky on the tracking program some grad student had loaded weeks earlier, and nobody had told it the world was ending. So it kept turning. 200 tons of steel, groaning on its bearings, chasing a quasar that didn't care that the highways were full of stalled cars and the cities were burning 40 miles to the west. I'm Del Hierro. I was 51 that spring, the facilities engineer for the Cardona Ridge Observatory out in the high desert east of the mountains. And I'd worked that site for 19 years. I knew every pump, every breaker, every length of conduit buried under that hardpan. What I didn't know, standing in the control room at 4 in the morning, watching the dish slew against a sky the color of a bruise, was that the military convoy we'd been promised on the emergency channel was already too late. The outbreak had reached us first. I just hadn't seen it yet. Before I take you through what happened up there, I want to say a quick thank you to everyone who keeps coming back for these stories, and welcome if this is your first night with us. If grounded survival stories like this are your kind of thing, subscribe, leave a comment, and stick around. It genuinely helps this channel keep going. Now let me take you back to that ridge. The observatory wasn't much to look at. People hear observatory and picture some white dome on a postcard. Cardona Ridge was a working site, ugly and practical. A long, low concrete operations building, a maintenance shed, 2 fuel tanks on saddles, a water tower we filled from a well that ran 1,100 feet down into the rock, and the dish itself. The big radio antenna, sitting up on the ridge a quarter mile above the buildings on its own access road. We weren't an optical place. We listened. We mapped hydrogen across the galaxy and tracked spacecraft for a contract that kept the lights on. We were the kind of place that mattered to maybe 400 people on the planet and nobody else. That mattered a great deal once everything went sideways, because it meant we were alone. The nearest town, Eldonwash, was 31 miles down a county road that turned to washboard gravel for the last 9. The interstate was further. We had no neighbors. We had a fence that was meant to keep coyotes and curious tourists off the equipment, not anything worse. There were 6 of us on site when it started. I'll get you their names because they're going to matter. There was Ramona Telfer, the site director, mid-40s, a careful woman who'd come up through orbital mechanics and ran the place like she expected an audit every Monday. There was Booth Castellan, our senior astronomer, 62, gray and stooped and unbothered by almost everything, who'd been at Cardona longer than I had. There was a young postdoc named Hessler, first name Wren, but everybody called her Hessler, who slept maybe 4 hours a night and lived on the kind of coffee that could strip paint. There was Tobias Quill, our other engineer, a 38-year-old former Navy electrician's mate who could fix anything with a current running through it, and who I trusted more than almost anyone I'd ever worked with. And there was a contractor, a man named Pell Aldecott, who'd driven up 2 days before the collapse to service the cryogenic cooling on the receiver, and then couldn't leave because the roads closed. Pell was a stranger to us. That ended up mattering too. The news had been bad for about a week. You remember how it goes. First, it's somewhere else, some city you've never been to, some hospital overwhelmed. Then it's closer. Then the governor's on the radio saying, "Stay home." And the words don't match the flatness in his voice. We had satellite internet and a shortwave set and a NOAA, a weather receiver. And for 6 days, we sat up there on the ridge watching the country come apart through a screen. The way you'd watch a storm you were sure would miss you. It didn't miss us. Nothing missed anybody. What I remember most about those early days is the practical arguments. Ramona wanted to stay put. We had powered diesel gensets and a big solar array and battery banks for when the grid hiccuped, which it always had. We had water from the well. We had food in the commissary for maybe 3 weeks if we were careful. We had walls and a fence and distance. Distance was the big one. 31 miles of empty desert between us and the nearest human being. The math said stay. The math was good. Booth agreed with her. So did I mostly. The roads were the most dangerous place to be that was clear from everything we heard on the shortwave. The exodus out of the cities had turned the highways into slaughter. Stay still, stay quiet, stay fed, and wait for the convoy. Because there was a convoy. That was the other thing. 3 days into the collapse, a man's voice came up on the emergency frequency. Calm and clipped, military. He read off a list of designated shelter-in-place facilities that a National Guard element would reach on a clearing route, and Cardona Ridge was on the list. Federal property, defensible, off the main routes. They'd reach us, he said. Hold position. Maintain your power and water. Mark your roof. Days, not weeks. We marked the roof. Tobias and I painted a white cross on the operations building flat top with the line striping paint from the maintenance shed, big enough to see from a helicopter. We rationed the food. We kept the gensets fueled and the batteries topped. We waited. And the dish kept turning because nobody had thought to stop it. And I think part of me liked that it kept turning. It felt like the world hadn't entirely ended if the machine was still doing its job. That was the situation at 4 in the morning on the 9th day. When I went out to check the genset fuel feed, and the first thing I noticed was that the coyotes had stopped. You have to understand the desert at night to understand why that froze me. Cardona Ridge was never silent. There were coyotes, always, calling back and forth across the washes, and the little scuttling things in the brush, and the wind in the antenna struts, making that low harmonic hum. 9 days of collapse hadn't changed the desert at all. The desert didn't know. So when I stepped out the south door with my flashlight and a clipboard, expecting the same noise I'd heard every night for 19 years, and got nothing, no coyotes, no scuttling, just the wind and the slow groan of the dish up on the ridge. Every hair on my arm stood up. Animals go quiet when something's moving through that doesn't belong. I stood there in the doorway with the light off, letting my eyes adjust, and I listened. The fuel feed could wait. I'd learned a long time ago that on a site like ours, the building tells you what's wrong before you see it. And so does the land around it. Right then, the land was telling me something was out past the fence. I went back inside and woke Tobias. He came up out of sleep the way Navy men do, all at once and quiet, no questions until he was on his feet. I told him about the coyotes. Anyone else, that would have sounded like nothing. To Tobias, it didn't. He pulled on his boots, and we went to the control room, where the security monitors were 4 cameras. All we had, covering the main gate, the fuel tanks, the parking apron, and the base of the ridge road. The gate camera showed the gate. The fuel camera showed the tanks. The apron camera showed our 3 vehicles parked nose in. And the ridge camera, the one pointed up the access road toward the dish, showed something I looked at for a full 10 seconds before I understood it. There was a person on the road, halfway up between us and the dish, standing in the wash of the security floodlight at the second switchback, not moving, just standing, facing up the hill toward the antenna. "Pal," Tobias said. We did a quick count in our heads. Pell's room was on the far end. Could have been him, out for some reason, though God knew what reason a man would have to walk up a quarter-mile grade at 4 in the morning. I keyed the intercom to Pell's room. Nothing. I keyed Ramona's. She answered, fogged with sleep. and I asked her if Pell had said anything about going out. She said no, and then she said, in a different voice, "Why?" I told her to come to the control room and to wake Booth and Hessler quietly. No lights in the windows. On the screen, the figure on the road turned its head. Not the smooth turn of a man looking around. It was wrong, too far, the neck rotating past where a neck wants to go. And it held there, head cocked, facing the camera now. Even at that distance, even in the grainy infrared, I could see that the face was wrong. The jaw hung. There was a darkness down the front of the shirt that wasn't shadow. And then it started walking down the hill toward us. And its gait was wrong too fast, lurching, the legs moving like the body had forgotten how heavy it was. "That's not Pell," Tobias said quietly. Ramona came in then, with Booth a step behind her tying a robe. And the two of them looked at the screen, and the room went very still. Hessler arrived last, blinking, and she made a small sound when she saw it. "How did it get up there?" Booth said. "The fence." That was the right question, and I didn't have an answer. The access road came up from inside our perimeter. The dish was inside the fence. For that thing to be on the ridge road, it had to have come through the fence somewhere. Or it had been inside already. "Where's Pell?" Ramona said. Wasn't a question anymore. I went down the corridor to Pell's room with Tobias behind me and the big mag light in my hand for lack of anything better. And the door was ajar. And the bed was empty, and the sheets were on the floor. And there was a smell in there, copper and something sour underneath it, that I will be smelling for the rest of my life. The window was open. The screen was pushed out. There was a dark handprint on the white sill. We didn't have to say anything. We backed out of that room and shut the door, and I felt the whole shape of the next days arrange itself in my mind. Cold and clear. The outbreak hadn't come up the road behind a convoy. It had already been inside our walls. Pell had brought it. Pell had been bitten, or had been sick days ago. And we'd been sealed up in here, rationing food and painting crosses on the roof, with the thing already breathing the same air. Back in the control room, the figure had reached the bottom of the ridge road. The camera there caught it crossing the apron toward the vehicles. Up close now, the floodlight on the building's corner lit it well enough that there was no more pretending. The torn throat, the way the eyes caught the light flat, like an animal's, like there was nobody behind them. It was Pell. It had been Pell. It walked into the side of my truck hard and didn't stop, just leaned into it and pushed, mindless. And then it heard something one of us breathed wrong. Or the genset cycled, and its head snapped toward the operations building. And it came at the south door at that lurching run. I'd left the south door unlocked when I came back in. I have never moved as fast as I moved across that control room. Down the corridor, the south door at the end. And I could see through the wire glass window the shape of it crossing the apron. And I hit the door with my shoulder and threw the deadbolt and stepped back just as the whole frame shuddered. It hit the door like a sack of wet sand thrown by a machine. Again, the wire glass spidered but held. The thing's face pressed against it, the jaw working, no sound coming out, which was the worst part. It didn't groan or scream. It just worked its mouth against the glass and beat its body against the steel, tireless. While I stood there with my back against the corridor wall and my heart trying to climb out of my throat. Tobias appeared beside me with the only firearm on the entire site, a lever-action .30-30 that Booth kept in his truck for the drive-out because there were stretches of that county road where a man liked to have something. 8 rounds in the tube, a box of 20 in Booth's glove box. That was our arsenal against the end of the world. A deer rifle and 28 cartridges. Not through the door, Tobias said. Ricochet, and we don't know what's behind it. He meant the fuel tanks, the propane for the commissary, the whole site's worth of things that didn't take kindly to bullets. He was right. He was always right about that kind of thing. So we let it beat itself against the door, and we went back to the control room, and we sat in the blue light of the monitors and watched the thing that had been a man hammer at our walls until the sky went gray, and we talked in low voices about how we were going to live. That was the first night. I'm telling you all this because I want you to feel what we felt, that the danger wasn't out there. Past the 31 miles of desert. It had come in through a window with a contractor's name on the door. If you'd been up on that ridge with us, listening to that thing work the bolt of the south door with its dead hands, I want to know what you'd have done first. I'll tell you what we did. We made an inventory. That was Ramona's instinct, and it was a good one. When the sun came up and the thing outside, we never gave it a name. We just called it the one on the apron was still circling the building. Mindless and tireless. She sat us all down at the long table in the commissary, and we counted what we had. Because counting is what you do when you can't yet act. It steadied us. It gave the fear somewhere to go. Power first, because power was everything. We had 2 diesel gensets, primary and backup, and roughly 900 gallons of diesel in the saddle tanks. At our reduced load, we'd shut down the cryogenics and the big receiver. No point cooling a telescope. Nobody would read that fuel would run us a long time, weeks if we were careful, longer if the solar array carried the daytime load, and we only ran the gensets at night and on overcast days. The batteries were healthy. Power was our strength. As long as we had power, we had lights, the well pump, the freezers, and the radios. Water next. The well was 1,100 feet deep, and the pump was a submersible on its own dedicated circuit. As long as the power held, the water held. We had the tower full, 8,000 gallons, gravity-fed, so even a pump failure gave us days. Water was fine. Water was the desert's one mercy to us. Food was the problem. 3 weeks at careful rationing, less now that we'd be burning nerves and not sleeping. The commissary was stocked for a crew of 12 and we'd been 6, but 9 days in, we'd already eaten through the fresh, and were into cans and rice, and the big institutional bags of dried things. Call it 18 days if we were disciplined. That number sat on the table between us like a sentence. The convoy was supposed to come in days, not weeks. So 18 days should have been plenty. Should have. And then the weapons, which I've told you. The .30-30, 8 in the tube, 20 in the box. A spear gun nobody knew why we had. The tools in the maintenance shed, which Tobias eyed in a way that told me he was already building things in his head. A flare gun in the safety locker with 3 flares. That was the arsenal. We don't fight it, Ramona said. We outlast it. The convoy comes, they take it down, they take us out. We keep the walls between us and it, and we wait. She looked at me. Del, can we make the building airtight? If there's more than one of those out there, eventually, I want every door and window accounted for. I could, mostly. The operations building was concrete with steel doors, built to keep desert dust out of sensitive equipment, which meant it was built tighter than most buildings. There were 11 exterior doors, and the windows were fixed glass, except in the residence wing, where Pell's open window had let it out in the first place. I made a list. Tobias and I would seal the residence windows from inside with the plywood and lag bolts from the shed. We'd reduce the building to one controlled entry, the main vestibule, double-doored, which we could hold. That was the plan. It was a good plan. We started on it that first morning. while the thing that had been Pell circled the building. And for 2 days, it almost worked. I want to tell you about those 2 days, because they're where I learned the rhythm of the thing on the apron. And that rhythm is what kept us alive later. It didn't sleep, it didn't tire, but it wasn't smart either. It responded to sound and to movement seen through the windows. And when it had nothing to respond to, it slowed down, drifting around the building in a slow circuit, sometimes standing still for an hour, facing nothing. Noise drew it. The genset starting drew it. A dropped tool drew it. So we learned to move quiet, to mask our work behind the genset's run cycles, to keep away from the windows. Tobias rigged the plywood over Pell's window from inside, while Hessler and I made noise on the far side of the building to pull the thing around the corner. It worked. We sealed the residence wing window by window, and the thing never understood that the noise was bait. It was on the second day, with 5 of the 6 residence windows boarded, that Booth found the second problem, and the second problem was worse than the first. He'd gone up to the control room to do what he did every few hours, which was sit at the short wave in the emergency receiver and listen for the convoy. Booth was the one who believed in the convoy most. He'd been government his whole career, and he trusted the voice on the emergency frequency the way you trust a thing that has never once let you down. He'd sit there with the headphones on and a legal pad and copy down anything he heard. And he heard a lot, those days fragments, other survivors, a woman somewhere reading psalms into a dead channel, a man counting, just counting, hour after hour. God knows why. That afternoon, Booth came down the corridor moving faster than I'd ever seen him move, the legal pad in his hand, and his face had gone the color of the concrete. "The convoy's not coming," he said. He'd caught a transmission, military, same clipped cadence as before, but a different man. It wasn't meant for us. It was a unit-to-unit call, in the clear, because whoever sent it was past caring about protocol. The clearing route had been abandoned. The element that was supposed to reach the designated facilities had been overrun 40 miles west, at a town called Saddle Junction, where they'd tried to hold a bridge, and the bridge had gone bad on them. The voice said the route was black. It said all designated facilities east of the divide were on their own. It said it twice, like the man saying it couldn't believe it either. And then the channel went to static and stayed there. We were east of the divide. We were a designated facility. We were on our own. And we'd been counting on 18 days of food to last us until a rescue that was now a column of burned vehicles on a bridge 40 miles away. I watched that knowledge go around the commissary table, and I watched what it did to people. Because that's the moment a group either holds together or comes apart. Ramona went very still and started, I could see it, recalculating everything. Booth aged 10 years in front of me. The man's whole faith was in that convoy, and it had just died on a bridge. Hessler started crying without making any sound, which somehow was worse than if she'd wailed. Tobias didn't change at all on the outside, but he looked at me, and I knew what the look meant. It meant, now we plan to get out, because nobody is coming to get us. 18 days of food, Ramona said finally into the silence, and no rescue at the end of it. She put both hands flat on the table. So we have 18 days to solve our own problem? Or we starve up here in a building that's surrounded? It's one, Hessler said. It's just the one out there. It's one that we know about, I said, because somebody had to. Pell came up here clean 9 days ago and turned in his sleep. We don't know what's out past the fence. We don't know what came up the county road behind it. We've had our heads down sealing windows. We don't actually know what's out there anymore. That landed badly. And it should have, because it was true, and it changed the question. We weren't waiting anymore. Waiting was a luxury for people with a rescue coming. We had to leave. And to leave, we had to cross open ground to the vehicles. And the vehicles were where the thing on the apron had been beating itself for 2 days. And beyond, the vehicles were 31 miles of road we knew nothing about. If you've been counting the ways out with me, I'd be curious where you land because we argued it for an hour, and I'm still not sure we chose right. The vehicles were the heart of it. We had 3. My pickup, Booth's truck with the rifle and ammunition in it, and the site's flatbed utility truck. The slowest and ugliest, and the one with the best range and the most fuel. All 3 were parked nose in on the apron, maybe 40 yards from the south door, in the open, in plain sight of the thing that walked. Getting to them meant crossing 40 yards of nothing, with at least one of those things between us and the keys. And the keys to all 3 hung on the board in the vestibule, which was fine. But a key does you no good if you can't reach the truck. Tobias laid it out the way he laid everything out, flat and practical, no drama in it. One of those things, alone in daylight, we can handle if we control the engagement. We draw it to one side of the building, 2 of us go out the far side, get to the flatbed, get it running. We don't need all 3 trucks. We need one with range. The flatbed holds all 6 of us in the cab and the bed. We load water and what food's left, and we drive. But, and here he held up a finger, the flatbed's been sitting 9 days in cold nights. The glow plugs are tired. It might not catch on the first turn. If it doesn't catch fast, whoever's in that cab is sitting in the open making noise, which is the one thing that brings them in. So before we commit a single person to that apron, I want to know the flatbed starts. And the only way to know is to get to it and try it. It was a clean problem with no clean answer. We needed to test the truck before we bet our lives on it. And testing the truck was itself a bet of our lives. We spent the rest of that second day building the thing that would let us do it. Tobias's idea, and it was a good one, was to control the engagement instead of just dodging it. He took 2 long sections of the steel handrail from the maintenance shed catwalk, and we cut them and bolted them into a pair of crude pikes, 8 feet long, with a flattened chisel point on the business end. The reach mattered. Everything we'd seen on the apron told us the thing was strong and tireless and absolutely without fear. But it was also without strategy. If you could keep 8 feet of steel between you and it, you could control where it went. And you could, if it came to that, put it down without ever letting it touch you. The skull was the only thing that worked. We'd watched it take its whole body against a steel door for 2 days without slowing. So a body shot meant nothing. It had to be the head. We tested the pikes against nothing, just practicing the motion in the corridor, 2 of us at a time. And I'll tell you, it felt absurd and obscene at the same time. Grown professionals drilling with homemade spears in a government building while a dead man circled outside. That night, Booth sat at the radio again, and I think he was looking for the convoy out of habit, the way you reach for a railing that isn't there. What he found instead changed the shape of everything. And it's the thing I think about most. He found Pell's phone, not literally, but on the shortwave, drifting in the noise. Booth caught a looping automated transmission, a low-power emergency beacon, the kind that broadcasts a recorded data burst on a survival frequency. It was close. It was very close. Strong signal, no fade. Booth triangulated it against the site map with the directional antenna we used for spacecraft tracking. And the bearing put it up on the ridge, up at the dish. The recorded burst, when Hessler decoded it on the laptop, was a man's voice, and the voice was Pell Aldicott's. And it had been recorded 4 days before any of this, before he turned, on the night the roads closed. This is Pell Aldecott, contractor at Cardona Ridge Observatory. If anyone hears this, I've got a vehicle, a service van, parked up at the Dish Foundation under the tarp. Diesel, full tank, long range. The road up there connects to the old maintenance track on the back side of the ridge that comes down to the highway bypass, misses Eldon Wash entirely. I don't feel right. I think I'm sick. I'm setting this to loop in case somebody comes who can use the van. The track's gated, but the lock's a county padlock. The combination's the site number, 8114. God help whoever finds this. 6 of us stood around that laptop and listened to a dead man tell us there was a second vehicle we'd never known about his service van. Full of fuel, parked under a tarp at the Dish Foundation, up the Ridge Road, the same Ridge Road the thing had walked down 2 nights ago. And that van had a route off the back of the ridge that avoided the only town we'd have had to drive through. The town the Convoy transmission had warned us was bad. It changed everything. And not in the way you'd think, because now we had 2 ways out. And they pointed in opposite directions. And the people in that room split right down the middle on which one was the trap. Ramona wanted the flatbed. Known truck on the apron. 40 yards, one thing in the way, and out the front gate down the county road. The county road went through Eldon Wash, yes, but it was a road we knew, and known was worth a great deal. Tobias wanted the van. Better range, the back route that avoided the town. A tank Pell swore was full. But the van was a quarter mile up the ridge, on a road that climbed, in the open the whole way, toward the Dish, toward exactly where Pell had been before he turned. Which meant if there was a place on that site where you'd expect to find more of them, it was up at the Dish. Booth, gray and shaken, said the thing none of us wanted said. Pell walked down from the Dish. If Pell was up there, and Pell turned up there, then whatever Pell was doing up there before he died, he might not have been alone. He drove that van up. Why would a man park a service van at the Dish Foundation? There's nothing to service up there that he was hired for. He was here for the receiver cooling, down here, in this building. The room got quiet, because Booth was right, and we all felt the wrongness of it at once. Pell had no business at the Dish, and yet his van was up there, and his beacon was up there, and he died up there and come down. There was a story up on that ridge that we didn't have, and the only way to learn it was to climb toward it. We voted, and the vote split 3-3. Ramona, Booth, and Hessler for the flatbed and the known road. Me, Tobias, and to my surprise, the absent Pell, in the sense that I trusted a dying man's deliberate recorded directions more than I trusted a road the military had called black. Tobias and I wanted the van. We didn't resolve it that night. We were too tired and too scared to choose, and choosing felt like a thing you could die of. We agreed to sleep on it, 2-hour watches, and decide at first light. I took the second watch, in the control room, with the monitors and the .30-30 across my knees and the homemade pike leaned against the wall. And somewhere around 3 in the morning, the thing on the apron stopped. Not slowed, stopped. Stood dead still in the middle of the apron, facing the Ridge Road, the way it had been facing up the hill that very first night. And then it began to walk not toward the building, not its usual circuit, but up the Ridge Road, away from us, back toward the Dish, with that lurching purpose, as though it had been called. I watched it climb the switchbacks on the Ridge camera until it passed out of the floodlight's reach and the screen had nothing left to show me. And I sat there in the dark, thinking about Booth's question. Why would a man park a van at the Dish? And I had the first cold edge of an answer. And I didn't like it at all. Because the Dish was still moving, slewing on its program, chasing the sky. and our directional antenna had caught Pell's beacon coming from up there, strong and clear. And I, a man who'd kept that site running for 19 years, knew something the others were too frightened to think about. The dish wasn't just a receiver. It could transmit. We used it to send commands to spacecraft. It put out power. And a thing that responds to sound and signal, the way these things did, what would 200 tons of transmitting antenna do to something like that, swinging its beam across the desert all night long? I didn't have it all yet. But I had enough to know that the ridge was not just a place where one man had died. The ridge was doing something. And at first light, when we made our choice, I was going to have to decide whether to walk 6 living people toward it. Morning came hard and bright the way it does in the high desert, the light coming over the eastern flats flat and merciless. The thing on the apron hadn't come back. That was new. And new was dangerous, because we'd built our whole sense of safety around knowing where it was. I told them what I'd seen the thing walking up the ridge in the night, called by something. I told them what I'd been thinking about the dish, that it transmitted, that it put out power, that it had been swinging its beam over the whole site for 9 days, and nobody had stopped it. I watched the idea land. Hessler got it first, because she was the youngest and the quickest, and her field was signals. "You think it's drawing them," she said. "The transmit beam. You think the dish is a lure?" "I think Pell drove a van up to the dish for a reason," I said. "I think the beacon's up there for a reason. And I think a thing that responds to signal might respond to the biggest signal source for 100 miles, which is sitting on our ridge swinging back and forth all day and all night. I don't know that. But the thing walked up there in the dark like something called it. And the only thing up there that could call anything is the dish." Ramona didn't like it, and I understood why. It made her preferred plan worse. The flatbed went out the gate and down the county road, away from the dish, which sounded better until you realized that if the dish was drawing the things toward the ridge, then the safest place to be while you got a truck running was anywhere the dish wasn't pointing. And we had no way to know where that was, minute to minute. And it made Tobias's plan look like walking into the mouth of it, climbing the ridge road, toward the very thing that might be pulling the dead up the hill. "Then we shut it down," Tobias said simply, "before we do anything else. If the dish is the problem, the dish is the first thing we fix. Del, can we kill it?" I could. That was the bitter joke of it. I was the one man on Earth in a position to stop 200 tons of steel from broadcasting into the dark. And it would take me 10 minutes at the high-voltage panel in the operations building. We could safe the transmitter, park the dish, and stop the slew, all from a console I could reach without ever leaving the building. We didn't need to climb the ridge to stop the dish. We only needed to climb the ridge if we wanted the van. So we made our first real decision as a group. And it was the right one. And I'd make it again. Kill the dish first, from inside, and watch what happened. If the thing stopped coming, we'd learn something. If the apron stayed empty, we'd learn something else. Knowledge was cheap from inside the walls, and we were starving for it. I went up to the transmitter console with Tobias and Hessler, while Ramona and Booth watched the monitors and the doors. I'd safed that transmitter 1,000 times for maintenance. My hands knew it. I brought the high-power amplifiers down, watched the forward power meter fall to nothing, and then I commanded the dish to stow, to swing down from the sky and park face down at the horizon, the way we did for high winds. The whole building felt it. 200 tons of steel changing its mind comes down through the bedrock and into your feet. The groan of the bearings carried a quarter mile and through the concrete and up through my boots. And then it stopped. And for the first time in 9 days, The dish was still and silent and dark. We waited at the monitors for an hour. Nothing came up the road. Nothing came down it. The apron stayed empty in the hard morning light. "Doesn't prove anything," Booth said, but he said it quietly, the way you say a thing you don't believe. It didn't prove anything. But it was the first hour in 9 days that I'd felt the site go quiet in a way that felt like ours again, and not like something was using it. And it gave us the nerve to do the thing we'd been too frightened to do, which was open the door. Here's where I have to slow down, because this is the first time we went outside, and going outside was the whole game. The plan was small and careful. We needed to know the state of the apron and the vehicles, and we needed to test the flatbed, because whatever we decided about the van, the flatbed was the fallback, and a fallback that won't start is no fallback at all. 2 of us out, 4 in. Tobias and me, because we were the 2 who drilled with the pikes, and because if it went bad, I wanted it to go bad on the 2 of us who'd chosen it. Ramona on the south door, ready to throw the bolt the instant we were back through it. Booth on the monitors calling out anything that moved. Hessler on the rifle at the vestibule window, with strict instructions not to fire unless one of us was about to be taken, because every round we spent was a round we'd never get back. And the noise of a shot would carry to the ridge and to wherever else the dead were standing in the brush. We went out the south door at mid-morning into the kind of bright stillness that the desert does better than anywhere. The air already shimmering off the hard pan. The white cross we'd painted on the roof pointless now above us. 40 yards to the flatbed. We crossed it slow and quiet, pikes up, scanning, and I have never been so aware of the sound of my own boots on gravel. The flatbed sat where it always sat. Tobias went to the driver's door, and I stood as cover, pike up, turning a slow circle, watching the corners of the building and the mouth of the ridge road and the line of brush along the fence. He got in. He didn't slam the door. He pulled it to with a click and reached for the key we'd brought from the board. And he looked at me through the glass, and I nodded. And he turned it. The glow plug light came on. We waited. Diesel needs its glow plugs, and a cold, tired engine that sat 9 nights needs them more. And the seconds it takes for that little coil light to go out are the longest seconds a man can stand in the open. It went out. Tobias turned the key the rest of the way. The starter ground. The engine caught, coughed, almost died, and then caught again and ran. Rough and smoking and beautiful. The ugliest, sweetest sound I've heard in my life. Tobias let it idle, watching the gauges. And I kept turning my slow circle, and that's when Booth's voice came over the little handheld radio clipped to my collar, tight and wrong. Ridge Road, coming down, more than one. I looked up the hill. They came around the second switchback into the open, 3 of them, in the bright, flat light, walking down toward us with that terrible, tireless lurch. Drawn, I understood it even then, even with the dish dead, not by the dish at all this time, but by the only loud thing for 31 miles, which was the diesel engine we'd just started. The dish hadn't been the only lure. The dish had been a lure. We were a lure too, the moment we made noise. And we just made the loudest noise on the ridge. "Kill it," I said to Tobias. "Kill it, get out, we go back." He killed the engine. The silence afterward was enormous, and it was too late. The 3 on the ridge road had us. They were 100 yards out and closing at that walking lurch that covered ground faster than it had any right to. And Tobias was getting out of the cab. And the geometry of it was suddenly very simple and very bad. 40 yards back to the south door for us, 100 yards down the ridge road for them. And they were already moving, and we were just starting. "Go," I said. "Go, I'll set the line." That was the first real fight, and I want to tell it true, because afterward, people always make these things sound braver and cleaner than they are. Tobias didn't argue, which is how I knew it was bad. He broke for the south door at a dead run, and I planted myself between the flatbed and the building with the pike, because the thing I'd learned in 2 days of watching them was that they came straight at the nearest moving thing. And if I was the nearest moving thing, they'd come at me and not at the door. And the door was where everyone I had left in the world was standing. The first one reached me 10 yards ahead of the others. It had been a woman once, in a county sheriff's uniform, which told me a piece of the story of the county road I'd have rather not known. I set the pike the way we'd drilled, butt braced against my hip and my back foot, point up at the face, and I let her run onto it. And the chisel point went in under the cheekbone, and the weight of her drove it, and the whole shock of 200 pounds of dead momentum came up the steel into my arms and my spine. She didn't stop because of pain. There was no pain in her. She stopped because the point had gone up into the brain, and the thing that drove the body simply switched off. All at once, the way a motor stops when you pull its leads. She dropped. The pike came with her, and I nearly went down on top of her, and I wrenched it free with both hands, slick now, and brought it up just as the second one closed. The second one I missed. The point skated off the side of the skull, glancing, and then it was inside the reach of the pike, and the pike was no good to me, and it had a fistful of my jacket, and its face was coming at mine, the mouth working. And I will tell you that the strength in it was not human. It was the strength of a thing with no governor, no part of it holding back to protect itself. And it bent me backward over the flatbed's fender by the front of my jacket alone. The rifle went off, Hessler from the vestibule window. Against orders, the one shot. And it took the second one through the side of the head from 40 yards, which is shooting I still don't fully believe. And the grip on my jacket let go all at once, and I went down hard on the gravel with a dead weight on top of me and a ringing in my ears, and the third one still coming. I got the dead weight off me. The third one was almost on me, and the pike was on the ground, 3 feet away. And there was no time for the pike, and I did the only thing left, which was roll under the flatbed, into the dark and the oil smell and the heat already coming off the engine. And it came down onto its hands and knees at the edge and reached for me, and I kicked it in the face with both boots, once, twice, and it kept reaching, tireless, mindless, fingers raking the gravel toward my ankles. And then Tobias was there, on the far side of the truck, with the second pike. He hadn't run for the door. He'd run for the spare pike we'd staged by the south wall and come back, the fool, the friend. And he drove it down through the back of the thing's neck and into the base of the skull. And it stopped reaching. And I scrambled out the far side, and we both ran for the door. And Ramona had it open exactly wide enough, and we went through it, and she had the bolt thrown before the echo of the rifle shot had even finished bouncing off the ridge. We stood in the corridor, the three of us, Tobias and me coated in gravel, and worse, shaking. And Hessler came down from the vestibule white as the wall with the rifle still in her hands. And nobody said anything for a while. Then I looked at her, and I said the only thing worth saying, which was, 7 left. Because that was the cost, laid bare. We'd gone out for 10 minutes to test a truck, and we'd come back having spent one of our 28 cartridges, and we'd learned that the dead came to the sound of an engine, which meant the flatbed, the known truck, Ramona's truck, the safe choice would call every dead thing on the ridge the moment it started, every single time, forever. That changed the math, and Ramona knew it before I said it. The flatbed worked. The flatbed started. and the flatbed was a dinner bell. We could not start that engine, on that apron, 40 yards from the building, without bringing down on us exactly what had just nearly killed me. And we'd seen 3 come from one short idle. How many would the long churn of starting cold and loading 6 people and supplies bring? More than 7 bullets could answer. More than 4 people with 2 pikes could hold. The van up the ridge suddenly didn't look like the trap anymore. The van looked like the only door out that didn't ring a bell the dead could hear, because Pell's recording had said the back track came down the far side of the ridge, away from the brush, away from the county road, away from wherever the dead were standing. And the noise of starting the van would happen up at the dish, a quarter mile from where any survivor would have to wait, instead of 40 yards. But to get the van, we had to climb the ridge, and now we knew the ridge had at least the 3 dead I'd just helped put down, plus whatever had called them or come up after Pell, plus the unknown thing up at the dish that had made a dying man park his van there and set a beacon and warn the world. "We're going up," Ramona said. It cost her to say it, because it meant her plan was the wrong one, and she was the kind of person who hated being wrong more than she hated almost anything, and she said it anyway. And that's when I started to trust her completely. We go up the ridge, we get the van, we come down the back track. But I want to know what's up there first. I'm not walking us blind into whatever made Pell drive a van to a place he had no business being. And that was the decision that took us up the hill. And up the hill is where the story stops being about the dead at all and starts being about the living, and about what Pell had really been doing on Cardona Ridge. We couldn't go up blind, and we had a way not to. The dish had cameras of its own, engineering cameras mounted on the structure. One on the elevation axis pointed down the access road. One in the equipment room at the base of the dish where the receiver electronics lived. They ran on the same network as the control room. With the transmitters safed and the dish stowed, those cameras were just sitting there. And I'd never thought to look at them, because in 19 years there'd never been a reason to watch the inside of our own equipment room. I pulled them up on the control room console. The road camera showed the ridge access road, empty now, the 3 I'd helped put down lying where they'd fallen on the apron below, and the long climb up to the dish foundation. And there, at the top, exactly where Pell's recording said it would be, a service van under a green tarp parked against the foundation wall. Then I switched to the equipment room camera, and the equipment room was not empty. There were people in it, living people. I want to be careful here, because the first jolt of it was joy other survivors, alive, a quarter mile away the whole time, and the joy lasted about 4 seconds, until I counted them and looked at how they were arranged and understood what I was seeing. There were 5 of them, and they were not sheltering, they were working. They had equipment in there that wasn't ours. Generators and a rack of radios and a satellite uplink dish set up in the corner, and they were moving with the unhurried competence of people who'd been somewhere a long time and meant to stay. And along the back wall of the equipment room, behind a chain-link partition that had not been there 9 days ago, there were 3 of the dead, restrained, standing, and a 6th living person in a respirator was doing something to one of them with an instrument on a long pole. I called the others over, and we watched it together. 6 of us crowded around a screen. And the temperature in that room dropped 10 degrees. Hessler figured it out first again. Because it was her field. And because the satellite uplink and the radio rack told the story to anyone who knew what they were looking at. "They're broadcasting," she said. "That's a high-gain uplink. They've been using our dish. That's why it was transmitting. It wasn't our tracking programs. Somebody overrode it. They've been pointing our transmitter at it something and studying what it does to them." She pointed at the chained dead and the figure in the respirator. "They're testing the signal on the infected, up here, on our ridge, with our equipment." The whole shape of it came together in that control room. And it was so much worse and so much smaller than the end of the world. There was no convoy coming because the convoy had died on a bridge, yes, but there was a different operation that had reached Cardona Ridge before either the outbreak or the military, and it had reached us through the one door we'd never thought to watch, which was the contractor we'd been told to expect. Pell Aldecott had not come up to service our receiver cooling. Pell had come up as the advance man for whatever these people were, a research element, a private one or a deniable one. It didn't matter which that wanted a powerful, remote, federally owned transmitter on a defensible ridge in the middle of nowhere to do work nobody would authorize in a city. He'd come early, set it up, and then he'd been bitten or infected by one of their own test subjects, and he'd known it. And instead of going to his own people, he'd crawled down to our building in the night to die in a stranger's bed. And his beacon, his confession, his van, all of it was a dying man trying to leave a door open for whoever came after. Because he'd seen what his own people were, and he didn't want them to be the only ones who got out. The dish hadn't been calling the dead by accident. It had been calling them on purpose. These people had been using our transmitter as a lure, drawing the infected up onto the ridge so that they'd have subjects to chain to a wall and study. The 3 I'd killed on the apron. The one I'd watched walk up the hill in the night they hadn't been wandering. They'd been called by people for a reason. And when I'd safed that transmitter and stowed the dish that morning, I hadn't just stopped a machine. I'd shut off their operation. I'd told them, in the only language that carries through bedrock, that someone in the operations building knew how to work the equipment and had decided to turn them off. They knew we were here. They'd known for 9 days. And I had just announced that we were a problem. "We have to assume they heard us shut it down," Tobias said, very quiet. "And we have to assume they heard the rifle. 1 shot this morning. That carries up here. They know we're armed, and they know we just stopped their work. So the question isn't whether they come down to us. The question is when and how many, and whether they talk first or just solve it." Booth, who had believed in the convoy with his whole heart, who had spent his career inside the government's idea of itself, looked like a man watching his own faith get autopsied. "Who are they?" he said. "Who does this?" "It doesn't matter who," Ramona said, and she was right. And it was the coldest and clearest thing anyone said in those days. It matters what they want and what they'll do to get it. They want the transmitter. We just took it from them. And we're sitting on top of the one vehicle out of here that doesn't ring a bell except the vans parked at their feet, in their equipment room's front yard. Whatever Pell meant that van for, it's theirs now. They're between us and the only quiet way out. I'd love to tell you we had a clever plan. We didn't, not at first. We had a screen full of armed strangers a quarter-mile uphill who knew we existed and had every reason to want us gone. And a known truck on the apron that would summon the dead the instant it ran, and 7 cartridges, and 2 homemade pikes, and 3 weeks of food shrinking by the day. We had 2 ways out, and both of them ran straight through people who would kill us, the dead, at the bottom of the hill. Drawn by any engine, the living at the top, who wanted their transmitter back. That's the place I'd want to ask you what you'd do if you'd been with us in that room. Because what we decided was the kind of thing you can't take back. We watched them for the rest of that day, learning them the way we'd learned the dead, because knowledge was still the only thing we had that they didn't know we had. We had eyes inside their operation, and they didn't know it. That was our one card. There were 6 of them, we confirmed, in 2 shifts. 4 awake at any time, 2 resting in a back room we couldn't see into. They were equipped, we saw rifles, real ones, slung and racked. not a deer gun with 7 cartridges. They had body armor on a rack. They were, whatever else they were, far better armed than 6 observatory staff with a .30-30. A straight fight was not a fight. It was an execution with us on the wrong end. But they had problems too. And watching, we found them. Their generators were running hard, and they were rationing fuel. We watched a man check a level and write it on a clipboard and frown. The universal expression of a man whose fuel is going faster than his plan allowed. Their satellite uplink had gone dead when I safed the transmitter, and they were frustrated by it. 2 of them working the rack and getting nowhere, because the high-powered chain ran through equipment in our building, on our side of the ridge, behind our doors. They needed the operations building. They could not do their work without the transmitter, and the transmitter answered to the console I was sitting at. That was the lever. They wanted in, and we held the door. And the dead were a problem for them too. Their chain-link partition held 3, but their whole method was to draw more in with the dish, and we'd turn the dish off, which meant their supply of subjects had stopped, but it also meant the dead already drawn up onto the ridge over 9 days were now wandering loose, uncalled, leaderless, somewhere on that hillside in the brush. I'd put 3 down on the apron. How many more had 9 days of broadcasting pulled up onto Cardona Ridge? More than 3. Probably many more than 3. They were out there in the rocks between us and the van, and now nothing was calling them anywhere, which meant they'd drift toward the next thing that made noise, and the next thing that made noise was going to be whichever side moved first. That was the truth I built our plan around. Lying awake on the 3rd night with the .30-30 across my knees. We did not have to beat the people on the ridge. We only had to make them. And the dead beat each other, and walk out the door in between. I'll tell you the plan plainly, because it's what we did, and it's the heart of it. The dish was the lever and the lure both. I could turn it on. I could command it to slew, to broadcast, to swing its beam across the desert, exactly the way it had for 9 days, the way that had pulled the dead up, onto the ridge in the first place. If I turned it back on, and pointed it not out at the empty desert, but down along the ridge, toward the brush where the uncalled dead were drifting, every dead thing in range would start moving toward the strongest signal, which would be the dish which sat at the foundation, in the front yard of the equipment room full of the people who wanted us dead. We would use their own lure against them. We would turn their tool back on and make it call the dead down on their heads. And while the dead and the living fought it out at the top of the ridge, we would not go up the ridge at all. We would take the flatbed. That was the turn nobody had seen, and it was Tobias who saw it. The flatbed rang a bell. Yes. But a bell only matters if there's something to hear it, and nothing better to go to. If the dish was screaming a 1/4 mile up the hill, drawing every dead thing toward the top of the ridge, then the flatbed's diesel grumble down on the apron would be the quieter sound, the wrong direction, drowned out by the louder lure above. We didn't need the silent van in its back road. We needed the bell to ring somewhere else, louder. And we had a 200-ton bell I could ring from a console. It was not a clean plan. Cleanness was gone from our lives. We were going to deliberately call the dead toward people. 6 living people, however bad they were, however much they wanted us gone, were human beings. And I was going to swing 200 tons of steel and point a horde at their door so that we could drive out the bottom of the hill while it happened. I sat with that. We all did. Ramona made us say it out loud, around the table, what we were choosing, because she didn't want anyone pretending later that it had been an accident. "We're going to get people killed to get out," she said. "Say you understand that, each of you, out loud. And we did, one by one. And Booth's voice broke on it, and Hessler closed her eyes, and Tobias said it flat and steady, and I said it last, and I have said it again every night since. Maybe you'd have tried to talk to them first. We talked about that too. We talked about hailing them on the radio, telling them we'd give them the transmitter back if they let us take the flatbed and go. But we'd seen the chain-link partition and the man in the respirator with the instrument on the pole, and we'd done the same cold math they'd do. A group that knew their secret was a loose end, and loose ends don't get waved out the gate by people doing the kind of work they were doing. We decided we could not trust a negotiation with people whose whole presence on that ridge was a thing nobody was ever supposed to find. Maybe we were wrong. I've turned that over 1,000 times. You tell me. But that was the call, and we made it together, and I won't pretend otherwise. We staged it carefully, because timing was the whole thing. The flatbed had to be loaded and ready and running and rolling within the window between when the dead reached the top of the ridge and when the people up there either died or broke and came looking for whoever had turned the dish back on. We loaded water in the night-quiet trips to the tower with cans and the 5-gallon jugs, while 2 watched the doors. We loaded the food, all of it. We loaded the rifle and the 7 cartridges and the 2 pikes and the flare gun. We did all of it in the dark with the dish still stowed and silent, so that when I turned it on, the only new sound on the ridge would be the thing I wanted them to hear. Tobias would drive the flatbed. He'd started on my mark, the mark being the moment the dish came up to full power and began its slew, and the instant it caught, the rest would load into the cab and the bed, and we'd roll for the gate, down the county road, the known road, Ramona's road after all, because the dish would be holding the dead at the top of the ridge, and the county road at the bottom would be the clearest it would ever be. I would be the last out, because I was the only one who could work the console, and I'd have to bring the dish up and then run the length of the building to the south door and the waiting truck while the bell I'd rung was still echoing. It was a 30-second window between the console and the truck. We timed it twice in the dark, me running the corridor empty-handed, Tobias counting. 31 seconds, then 29. 29 seconds in which the dead would be turning toward the ridge and not yet sorting out the smaller sound below. 29 seconds in which the people up top would be realizing their own lure had come back on without them and was bringing the horde down on their heads. 29 seconds for an old engineer to run the length of his own building and climb into a truck and live. We went at the gray hour before dawn, because that was when their resting shift was longest into its sleep, and their waking shift was at its lowest, the hour when the body most wants to quit. I sat at the console alone. Everyone else was at the south door or in the truck. I brought the high-voltage amplifiers up and watched the forward power meter climb, and I commanded the dish to rise from its stow and to slew along a line down the ridge, low, sweeping the brush, and then to broadcast, and 200 tons of steel groaned up off the horizon, and the whole building felt it come alive, and the meter pinned, and the dish began to swing. And on the equipment room camera, I saw a man's head come up sharp as the uplink suddenly showed signal it shouldn't have. And I saw him turn to wake the others. And on the road camera, I saw, almost at once, the first of them come out of the brush. The dead came to the dish. They came out of the rocks and the washes all along the ridge, more than 3, far more than 3. A slow tide of them converging up the hill toward the screaming antenna. And I sat 1 second too long watching it, watching 9 days of their harvest answer the bell, before I ran. I ran the corridor. Behind me, I heard the dish reach the top of its slew and reverse, the bearings shrieking. And under that, faintly, from a quarter mile up the hill, I heard the first gunfire, the people up top firing into the tide coming through their own front door. I hit the south door and went through it, and Tobias had the flatbed running, and the others were aboard. And I came across the apron, and Ramona had the cab door open, and I went in over her lap. And Tobias had us rolling before the door was shut. We went down the apron and through the gate Booth had unchained in the night and onto the county road. And behind us and above us, the ridge was all gunfire and the shriek of steel, the living and the dead fighting over a transmitter at the top of the hill, while 6 people drove out the bottom of it in the gray light. I looked back once. The dish was still swinging, still calling, lit now by muzzle flashes from the equipment room, and the tide was still climbing toward it. And I turned around and faced front, and we drove. We didn't make it out clean. I won't let you think we did. The county road wasn't empty. Some of the dead the dish had drawn over 9 days hadn't been up on the ridge they'd drifted down. Toward the road, toward the gate, toward the fence line, and the flatbed's diesel, quieter than the dish but not silent, pulled them out of the dawn the way I'd known it might. They came at us on the gravel where the road dropped into the first wash, a dozen of them strung along the cut. And Tobias had a choice between stopping and being swarmed or driving through. And he drove through. And the flatbed was built for it, and they were not. I will not describe what driving through a dozen of them on a gravel road in a flatbed truck is like. I'll only tell you that Booth, in the bed, fired 4 of our 7 cartridges in those 30 seconds at the ones that got hands on the rails, and that he was 62 and had never killed anything in his life before that week, and that he did it steady, and that when it was over, he sat down in the bed of the truck and didn't speak for 30 miles. We lost Hessler at the second wash. I have to tell it because it's true, and because she's the reason any of us lived twice over, once with that impossible shot at 40 yards that pulled a dead thing off my throat, and once at the second wash, where a hand came over the bed rail that Booth didn't see. And she did, and she put herself between it and Booth, and went over the rail with it into the dark of the cut. And Tobias couldn't stop, because stopping killed all of us, and so we didn't stop. And that is a thing the 4 of us who lived carry and will carry. She was 29. She lived on coffee that could strip paint. She made a shot at 40 yards in the open that saved my life. And then she chose in a half second to spend her own. And we drove on because she'd made the choice that gave the rest of us the road. If you want to know whether we made the right decision turning that dish back on, that's part of the bill it came with, and I lay it down here honest so you can weigh it for yourself. We made the highway bypass as the sun came up. The road there was clear, swept of the dead by nothing we understood, just one of the empty stretches the new world handed out at random. And Tobias drove until the fuel gauge made him stop, and we sat in the cab of a flatbed in the middle of an empty interstate, with the morning coming up over the flats, and nobody said anything for a long time. We never learned who the people on the ridge were. That's the part that has no ending. We never learned if any of them lived, or whether the dead took the whole equipment room, or whether the dish swung itself out until our diesel gensets ran dry days later and the bearings finally seized and 200 tons of steel went still for good with whatever was left up there. We never learned what they'd been broadcasting, or what they'd learned from 3 dead things chained to a wall behind chain link, or whether it mattered, or whether any of it ever reached anyone who could use it. Pell's beacon is probably still looping up there on the survival frequency. A dead contractor's voice telling a dead world about a van full of diesel and a county padlock with a combination of 8114 for anyone who comes after us and knows how to listen. We took the flatbed, not the van. Pell's gift went unused. I think about that. A dying man left us a quiet door out the back of the ridge, and we used a louder door and made him part of the lie we told the dead. And 4 of us lived, and 1 of us didn't. And the door he left swings open up there still, behind people who may or may not be alive, waiting for a survivor who'll never know it was meant for them. Here's the thing I keep coming back to, the thing I'd want you to take from a night spent up on Cardona Ridge with me. We sat in that building for 9 days, believing the danger was the 31 miles of desert and the convoy that would come across it to save us. We were wrong on both counts. The convoy never came, and the danger was already inside the fence, had come in clean through a door we'd been told to open, and was sitting a 1/4 mile up our own ridge, using our own machine against us the whole time. The safest place we knew turned out to be a place that was being used. And when the way out finally came, it didn't come as a rescue. It came as a choice to point a horde at strangers and drive out the gap, and to keep driving when 1 of us went over a rail in the dark. The dish was still moving when the world stopped. By now, I'd guess it's finally still. I hope it is. Some machines shouldn't keep doing their jobs after everyone who understood them is gone. If you made it this far up the ridge with me, I'm grateful for it. That's a long way to ride in the bed of a truck with strangers. If stories told this way are your kind of thing, stay with the channel and tell me in the comments where you were listening from tonight and whether you'd have turned that dish back on, knowing what it would call down. I've had a long time to decide, and I'm still not sure I'd answer the same way twice.